Whoa! Don't touch that dial, dudes and dudettes, because you're listening to Monsters, Madness, and Magic. Cowabunga! Whoa.
All right, folks, welcome to the Monsters, Madness, and Magic podcast. I'm your host, Justin, here with a quick word before we dive in. Now, in this episode, I chat with actor Townsend Coleman about getting started as a radio disc jockey, transitioning from commercials to voiceover, crafting the voice of Michelangelo for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Tick, and more. As always, thank you all for listening out there, and without further ado, here you go. All right, Townsend, take us back in time. You're a youngster. Are you a book reader, fort builder, troublemaker, or all of the above?
I was a fort builder.
I like that answer. I was a fort builder too.
Yeah. I was a bit of a book reader-ish, but I was building forts out of pretty much anything I could find. Of course, the classic, sofa, the couch cushions, and blankets and stuff. Yeah, but I was always doing that as a kid. For
Did
sure.
you live near any woods or anything like that? Was that where you were building them?
I did not. No. So my forts were pretty much all indoors or in my backyard.
Use your imagination.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Whereabouts did you grow up?
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah, I was there from the time. Well, I was actually in Denver before that until I was 7, and then moved to Cleveland when I was 7, and then moved out to L.A. here when I was 30, and that was 40 years ago. Literally, it'll be 40 years over Labor Day weekend.
Hey, time flies, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So would you say that either your parents or maybe someone else in your family were artistically, creatively inclined? Is that where your roots come from?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was. Well, both my parents were very creative. My mom was artistically creative, making crafts and designing stuff. It seemed like all the time. And my dad, I found out later in life, wanted to be an actor. I didn't know that when I was a kid, but my parents actually met when they were both working at NBC in New York City.
Wow.
So they were both working at 30 Rock, and in 1950 or 51 met there. My mom was working as a secretary in the radio division, and my dad was the head of the tour division. So he was the manager of the whole tour division there. So he was the boss of the pages. But what he really wanted to do was he wanted to be an announcer for the network. And yeah, that didn't work out for him for a bunch of reasons. And so that's when he moved us out of New York City to Denver in 1955. And so that's why I grew up there as a little kid and then moved to Cleveland from there. But my dad ended up getting on the radio in Denver and sort of getting that out of his system. But during that whole time, I just remember as a little kid, he was super into listening to radio dramas. Those old time radio dramas.
I still listen to them.
Yeah, and he had tapes of these that he would put on, and as a little kid, like 3, 4, 5 years old, I would lie on the floor in front of this massive speaker cabinet and just press my ear up against the grill and listen to these radio dramas. Because to me, as a little kid with my imagination, I was thinking this was all going on inside this box.
Yeah.
And so all these people and all these characters and all this music and all, the sound effects and everything, it was actually inside this box. I wanted to get inside the box.
It's like magic.
Yeah. And so that really, my dad was super into comedy albums, Bob Newhart and Bill Cosby and oh gosh, I'm blanking now. So I grew up, with a real appreciation for voiceover or for voice acting, even as a little kid, not having any idea what it was. So yeah, that was, I think, really the genesis of my interest in doing this stuff.
Wow. So specifically, when you mentioned radio, but when you think back to maybe films and TV shows that you grew up on, what comes to mind?
I remember my dad took us to, and I'm sure you're too young and probably never even heard of it, but it was a film called It's a Mad, 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 Mad World.
I've heard of it, but I have not seen it.
Dude, it's hilarious. I mean, at the time, and this is, in the 60s, it was just a classic, hilarious film with all the top comedians from that day. And I remember my dad taking us all as a family to see this movie in the movie theater, and this is back when the theaters weren't these little multiplexes, but, it was massive. And this was in like wraparound, whatever they called it, CinemaScope or something, but it was like really super widescreen. And I remember watching this movie, and I just remember my dad. Now, I was probably 6, maybe when I saw him, 7, and I thought it was funny. I thought it was very funny, as a 6 or 7 year old kid can think at that time, of this more adult stuff. But it was pretty goofy. But I just remember sitting next to my dad, and my dad just in tears, howling at this film. So that's really the first movie I ever remember seeing as a kid. And again, seeing my dad just laughing his butt off uh, over this movie, that's how I started really getting a sense of his sense of humor.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to me as I say this now, it was really always more my dad than my mom. My mom, I hate to say this, I know that she had a sense of humor, but it wasn't the same sort of kind of body, just in your face, slapstick kind of stuff that my dad loved. Uh,
Right.
so yeah, so that, and I remember too, and again, this is all my dad, it's not my mom, but in like the TV shows, I remember we would watch Man from Uncle was my dad's favorite show. So he had his chair, his red leather chair, and us 3 kids would sit around the chair on the floor and watch Man from Uncle with him, and then I remember we also had there was a variety show on Sunday nights that we would watch. Um, that was just, great fun and a lot of entertainment and very funny, a lot of comedians and stuff. So I think that's kind of where I started to get my appreciation, for the entertainment biz, I guess, is what it
Mm-hmm.
is. Yeah.
You mentioned all those great comedy albums. What about, was music big for you as well? Were you ever pick up an instrument, play in any bands or anything like that?
I did not. No, I always wanted to. My mom made us take piano lessons, which I just hated. And it kills me now because I wish I didn't hate it. I,
Yeah.
I wish I had stuck with it. I would love to have some, musical something under my belt. But I will say that I've got a pretty decent sense of rhythm. And so I've got a wild collection of hand drums and cajon boxes and djembes and rain sticks. I mean, all kinds of percussion stuff that from time to time I'll just put on some music and crank it up loud and just wail. I got a favorite cajon box. It's this blonde maple cajon box that's a little oversized, and I sit on it. And man, just playing that thing is like therapy for me.
Mm.
So that's really the extent of my musical ability. What's hilarious is that I actually have a lot of musical instruments. So I've got a sax and a clarinet and a couple of flutes and this beautiful, baby grand piano and I've got electronic drums, the Roland V drums. I mean, I got all this stuff, but where that comes from really is in large part my desire to want to be able to play these things, but is to have them around. And now, admittedly, I noodle on all of them, but I don't play any of them well. And I don't read music, and I'm not a musician as such, and I don't write music or songs or anything. So I just have these things around. But where that came from was I got married early when I was 20 years old, and my wife and I, she was 19 when we got married. We had our first child just before our first anniversary. So we were like these young kids having kids. And we ended up having 4 kids. But because I love music so much, it was important for me to have my kids kind of surrounded by it. So that's when I started buying some musical instruments in the hopes that maybe, one or more of my kids might pick up on it. And indeed, I've got 2 boys and 2 girls. And of course, they're all grown and gone now with their own families and kids. But my 2 boys are the ones who ended up picking up music and in a big way. My oldest son, yeah, picked up the guitar at 14
Mm.
and went on to do just amazing things with it. Had a band in high school that won and a national songwriting contest when he was a senior in high school. And the grand prize, it was sponsored by Pepsi. And the grand prize was to be flown to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland to play at the Rock Hall of Fame.
Jeez.
This song that they wrote and have it filmed, the performance for a Pepsi commercial. So what was wild about that, of course, is we all went back to Cleveland, our hometown, to watch this performance. And so, yeah, he is now a musician as well, and has a billion guitars and produces music and records other people and stuff. So, and then my youngest son, he's a drummer. So, yeah. So, and he's been in a bunch of bands, and they put out a bunch of CDs, and the whole nine yards. But yeah, both my boys picked up the music thing. My girls picked up the graphic arts side of things. So they're both visual artists and graphic artists, and my boys are musicians. So
wow, runs in the family.
Yeah.
Well, clearly you're a music lover. What are your go-to bands? Do you have any or records?
Yeah, I do. I mean, of course, I love a lot of the oldies. I was a radio disc jockey. I was a rock jock for 10 years back in Cleveland. So I worked at a bunch of different radio stations and a bunch of different genres, everything from beautiful music to disco. And then, of course, straight ahead top 40 and progressive rock. So yeah, I've got I don't really have much of an album collection anymore. Sadly, we had a music store back in Cleveland called Peaches, and we would get these what we called Peaches crates that we would put our albums in. And I had a couple of Peaches crates filled with albums before I moved out to LA. And when I got off the radio, I thought, you know what, I just don't need this stuff anymore. And CDs were coming in and LPs were going out. And so I left the entire collection at the radio station that I was working at. And I look back on that now and I just kick myself for not hanging on to some of these classic albums. But I would say now if I were to go see a concert right now, I'd want to go see Dave Matthews. He's probably my number one fave.
Would you say you were a theater kid? Did you start in drama or anything like that?
No, I didn't. Not when I was young, but when I was in fourth grade, I remember we had a class field trip to go see a live production of Peter Pan. And it was at a community youth theater, but there were adults in it too. And it was really professionally done. I mean, they had the kids, the family flying in this thing. So, but the thing about it is one of my best friends when I was in fourth grade, his brother was playing Michael in this production. So I was watching Michael most of the time because he was my best friend's brother, and I had met him. I knew who he was. But to me, seeing him from a distance on stage flying in this production of Peter Pan was like magic to me. And as for all I knew, I was watching a show on Broadway.
Right.
And when I saw his brother doing that, I thought, that is magic to me. I want to do that. And so it wasn't until I was in sixth grade that I started getting involved in theater, and then through middle, junior high, and middle school, and when I got into high school, I was doing a lot of theater productions. That was really probably the biggest thing that I was involved in school. And then when I went out to University of Colorado in Boulder for college, my first choice actually was I wanted to go to Cal Arts here in California because it was a total art school. And they were just starting the year I was graduating high school. And I told my mom that's where I wanted to go. And she looked at the catalog and she said, nope, if you're going to go to college and I'm going to pay for it, you're going to get a job doing something you can, make money in. And it's not going to be acting. So she put the kibosh on that. And I ended up going to University of Colorado because that's where my dad went. And we used to live in Denver and yada, yada. So I went out there as an architect major. And that lasted about 2 seconds. And at the end of my first semester, I just changed it over to theater arts. And
good choice.
Yeah. And then in my second semester there, I ended up getting the lead in the university production as a freshman, which was kind of a big deal back then because it pissed off all the upperclassmen, who'd been going to this 5-year program waiting for their shot. And, here comes this freshman kid taking this role. And yeah, it was a little divisive back then.
So, what do you consider your first time on stage as a performer to be? Did it go all smoothly? Any hiccups?
Well, my first performance, I remember when I was in 6th grade and on stage in a class and had to do a little sort of monologue, and they had these stage lights on below me, on the lip of the stage, and then on and so they had these with colored gels and stuff. And to me, it was like a whole different world. And I thought, this is magic.
Hmm.
And so that was my first time on stage proper, but my first time on stage actually in a production of something, if you don't count me being a cow in the Christmas pageant when I was 8, um, was really when I got into junior high school.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then did a lot of productions in junior high and high school.
So, Townsend, a question I like to ask everyone, that you could take it whichever direction you want to go with it, is what scared you as a kid?
German Shepherds.
Did you have a attack or something along those lines?
I didn't. It's just they looked mean and vicious to me. They looked like wolves. And there was a family had a German Shepherd on our block when I was a little kid, and yeah, just the way it bared its teeth and growled and stuff just terrified the crap out of me. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, they can be pretty scary. So,
Yeah.
were you doing radio and theater simultaneously in college?
I was not, no, I was not doing radio in college, although I was hanging out at the radio station on the college campus. Now, CU Boulder at that time, interestingly, had a great radio and TV department, but they didn't have a radio station that was actually on the air. They just had radio studios that you could, pretend in and practice in and stuff. So I would hang out over there a lot, and and I was taking classes in TV and radio production and all that, and then all the theater classes I could think to take as well. But I wasn't actually on the radio while I was in college. I was just doing pretty much theater, and I didn't
Gotcha.
graduate. I only went to school for a year and a half, and then like a knucklehead went home and got married. Yeah, that fall in the fall of 1974. Gosh, 50 years ago. Whew. Yeah.
So what was the genesis in radio?
Well, it really was my dad. My
Mm,
dad had been on the radio, and I knew that, and I used to listen to him when I was a little kid in Denver. So, I think that was probably the genesis of it. When I got out of college and got married, my wife's brother-in-law was actually working at a radio station, knowing that I wanted to get into radio, or at least try it. And he was getting fired from this radio station in 19, almost maybe early 75. They were changing formats from the rock format that they were. They were changing to beautiful music, and which is just elevator music, right?
mm.
And so all the jocks had to do is they didn't have to have any personality. It was just about time and temperature and maybe a little PSA or something. So he told me, my wife's brother-in-law told me that they were going to be hiring inexperienced people cheap, and that I should go down and just talk to the guy. So I did, and he hired me with no experience. So I was doing the graveyard shift, midnight to 6 on weekends. That's how I broke into radio. And then they fired me a year later, which is but still mystifying to me. But it happened. Happens a lot in radio. And I had a buddy who had been at that station, went over to another station in Cleveland that it was a rock station, but they were changing formats to a disco station in 1976. And so I ended up going over there and doing midnight to 6 at first, the graveyard shift. And then they put me on 7 to midnight, which was a blast. And then they gave me the morning drive slot. So I did morning drive there for about a year, and then quit that radio station to go down to another AM top 40 rock station. And, it's just a progression. You work at a bunch of different radio stations. The one thing I didn't want to do, I mean, I loved my time on the radio, but I didn't love the radio business so much that I wanted to travel around the country and working in, little dinky markets and working my way up that way. I had a young family. I, I just wasn't into moving like that. So if it didn't happen in Cleveland or thereabouts, one station I worked at was in Akron, but if it didn't if it required me to move, I didn't want to do it. But if I could do it without having to move, I was happy doing it. So that's what I ended up doing. And I did that for 10 years.
Are you familiar with John St. John?
No, but it sounds like a radio name.
Yeah, he was in radio. He's a voice actor as well, and he was
John St. John. Yeah.
and we were talking about the current state of radio, and he basically just said, like yourself, there was a certain point where he just felt like he had to get out because all the mom and pops were getting bought out by CBS Viacom, and it was all just watered down and no life to it, no personalities anymore, no actual disc jockeys.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was really lucky to work in radio in the days that I did, in the era that I did, because we're still spinning vinyl, on turntables with tone arms and needles, and that whole thing. And that was a blast. I loved that. It was all analog. I was the production director at a couple of the radio stations I worked at, and all our production was done on quarter-inch tape. Nothing was digital back then. This was between 1974 and 84. And in the early 80s, CDs were just coming online. And by the time I quit this last radio station that I was at, they were just starting to switch over from analog to digital. So they were getting rid of their turntables and starting to put everything on CD, and then eventually on computer, of course, and that's the way it all is done now. But so I was really lucky to have worked in that industry in the days that I did, because I was right there for the old stuff and then also the new stuff, which I wasn't as crazy about. But I got out of it because working in radio is where I discovered freelance voiceover work. And since I was a production director at this last radio station, my job was voicing all the commercials and that we had to produce at the station. And then I started getting calls from local ad agencies asking if I would, work for them for a client, say McDonald's or May Company or whatever. And that's when I discovered that I could actually do the kind of voice work that I was doing at the radio station and not getting paid for. I mean, that was just part of my job.
Right.
But here I could go and actually get paid for doing this freelance voice stuff. And so I joined the union, and man, my freelance voiceover stuff just took off. And so finally, after a decade on the air, I just pulled the plug on it because it was the last station I was at. I was my last Arbitron rating book showed that I was #1 in the market in my day part at that station. And I went in to ask for a raise, and they wouldn't even discuss it. And so that's when I gave them my 2-week notice. I realized that, there's just for me personally, there's no growth in it because I didn't want to be, a rock jock the rest of my life. And I didn't want to try and be some famous morning man because I knew that wasn't going to happen. So I thought radio's done for me. My thing is now voice work because it got to the point where I was making more money a year doing my freelance VO stuff than I was working at the radio station for 6 days a week.
Wow.
It didn't make any sense to me. So that's when I quit. And yes, and everything that John St. John said, I'm sure I would agree with. I look at the radio business now, and of course, I've got friends who are still in it, and they just hate it. They hate what it's become.
Were you were long out of the radio business by the time Sirius and stuff comes around, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So when it comes to voice acting specifically, what do you consider your quote unquote big break to be? Is it Michelangelo?
No, not really. I mean, Michelangelo certainly is probably the most well-known character that I do. That and the Tick, really, I think are the two that seem to be the most popular. When I go do these cons, the Comic Cons, and folks come up to my table, it's usually Michelangelo or the Tick that they want. But then when they see, oh, you were on Fraggle Rock? Yeah, I was Gobo, or oh, you were Waldo, you were whatever. Teen Wolf, yeah. Well, I didn't know that. Yeah. So, but as far as a big break goes, I think probably if I look at it practically, my big break was just getting a great commercial agent, within 2 weeks of moving here.
Yeah.
And these people ended up just being gold for me because they're the ones who would send me out on these auditions. Now, when I go audition, of course, it's up to me to get the gig. It's not up to them. But they had great connections, and they're the ones who uh, actually sent me on my first audition for a cartoon series called Inspector Gadget back in the spring of 1985. And I had never thought of doing cartoons before, even though I had done characters on the radio, and talking to myself and stuff. Uh, I didn't move out to LA to be a voice actor. I moved out here to be an on-camera actor in,
Hmm.
TV and film. Uh, and I pursued that for about 2 years and I just hated it. But this commercial agent that I got so quickly, they sent me on this audition for Inspector Gadget 6 months after I moved here. And I ended up getting a part on the series. And I had so much fun doing that. I'm in a studio now with Maurice LaMarche and Frank Welker and Don Adams and me. And I'm thinking, wow, this is wacky. How'd this happen?
Hmm.
And, so I asked my agents to send me out on more of that kind of stuff, and they did. And I just started, booking shows. So it wasn't really any one big break, but I will say, I think that if I hadn't gotten cast on Gadget, I probably I probably wouldn't have tried to pursue it.
Hmm.
It was only because I got on that show and saw what it was about that that really turned me on, and then that's when I wanted to pursue it. So I would say just getting booked, as Corporal Cape Man on Inspector Gadget, I'll help you. you know, yeah, an idiotic character that I understand is widely hated on the internet, but it did me good. It done served me well.
Right. So, you mentioned that you pursued acting in front of the camera for 2 years, but even though you gave that up, I would think that pursuing or being familiar with acting first, because you always hear that from people who do mainly voiceovers, is that it's still acting. So whether your voice is great or
Absolutely.
not, you're
Yep.
not going to be able to cut it if you can't act.
Yeah, absolutely. It's voice acting,
Yeah.
you know. So it's still acting as the foundation. You just happen to be using your voice then, your face and expressions and the rest of yourself. Although you do use all of that in voice acting, it's just the end product doesn't show it, um, except in what you hear.
Right.
Yeah.
So specifically for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, what do you recall about the audition? Was it a typical audition, right place, right time situation?
Yeah, I would say so. It was so Rob Paulson and I were working on a show called Fraggle Rock at that time, and our voice director, a gentleman named um, uh, Stu. I'm just going to say Stu.
Gotcha.
Uh, yeah, was our voice director, and he came into one of our Fraggle Rock sessions one morning, and he pulled out of his briefcase a Ninja Turtle comic book and showed it to us and said, "This is what I'm going to be casting and directing next. Do you believe this thing?" And I looked at the title and I thought, "Is this serious? Are you serious?" And he said, "Yeah, dead serious." I said, "Wow, man, what a crazy name. Well, good luck with that." And he said, "Well, I'll bring you guys in." So he brought us in to audition, and Rob and I ended up both getting parts on it. So I guess maybe we might have had a little bit of an edge just because we were already working with Stu. But yeah, the audition process was pretty typical. They give you, a sheet of paper and it's got a picture of the character on there and a couple of sample lines and then a description of what the character is about. The four of us who ended up getting cast, each of us auditioned for all four turtles. And when we got cast, they knew Rob was going to be Raphael, and they knew that Barry Gordon was going to be Donatello, but they hadn't decided yet whether I was going to be Michelangelo or Leonardo, and same with Cam Clark, who ended up being Leonardo. And so they were going to make up their minds for those two roles, at the first recording session. So we showed up at the session not knowing exactly what character we were going to be. And what they were going to, Stu's plan was to do 2 passes of it, record it twice, and have me do Michelangelo first and Cam do Leonardo, and then take a break and then do a second pass and switch. Well, they just never switched us for that second pass for whatever reason. And so I just, by the luck of the draw, I got Michelangelo instead of Leonardo. And that's the way it remains today.
Did you have a take or an idea of what you would have done for Leonardo?
Sure, it would have been just my voice and, just being sort of heroic. Come on, guys. We got to, although I'm a little foggy today, but, it would have been just sort of that, bold, let's go kind of leader kind of guy is what I did for my audition. And Cam, I'm sure, did a great Michelangelo for his audition as well, But they used Sean Penn from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the Spicoli character, as a prototype for Michelangelo's.
I can't unhear it now. I can see it.
Voice and demeanor. Yeah. Yeah. They just wanted him sort of, like kind of, well, they didn't want Mikey like too drugged out or anything, but he could be totally pizzaed out. It's like, whoa, dudes, that is bodacious.
Just a sidebar. I've spoken with Rob Paulson before. Just a genuinely nice guy.
Oh, he's an amazing man. Yeah, he sure is.
Because around the time, it wasn't long after he had recovered from his cancer that we spoke, and my grandma had just passed from cancer, and he sat and talked with me for a long time about it. It was just a nice gesture by him. I got nothing but respect for him.
Yep. That's Robbie through and through, for sure.
How far along the ride of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles did you realize just how big of a cultural deal it was?
I think within a couple of seasons, maybe in the second or third season, we knew it was doing well because we were getting renewed. Then that's really all you care about. But we also recognized that the Ninja Turtle toys were flying off the shelves at Toys R Us and KB Toys and all over the place, and so. We knew that there was a great, but when we saw, kids having Ninja Turtle birthday parties and stuff like that, after a couple of seasons, you realize, okay, you're part of, a bit of the cultural current zeitgeist, and that's kind of a cool place to be.
Yeah, and they're still around, still getting iterations, live action movies.
How about that? It's like the franchise that wouldn't die. Yeah. And listen, I'm not complaining, And as we look back on it, I look at all the iterations of Turtles, and I think that the thinking of this whole franchise is just brilliant. Because at first it was bothersome that when we were doing our original series and heard after a couple of seasons that they were going to be coming out with a live action movie, we thought for sure they're going to use us for the voices because we knew that there were going to be, cats in suits for this thing, and they'd need voices. So we figured, well, we are the Turtles; they'll use us. And then when they didn't, it was like, wait a minute, this isn't right. Kids are going to know the difference. They're not going to love it. Well, that wasn't true. Kids did love it, and come to find out that just because we were the original ones doesn't mean we have to be the only ones. And so and I didn't sort of realize this until many years later, looking back on it, and going to these Comic-Cons, realizing that really was the brilliance of this franchise, is that they didn't use us for the voices in the movies, and they didn't even keep the voices consistent in the movies. And then they came out with other iterations of cartoon shows, and we were never a part of any of that until Rob, of course, did Donatello in the 2012 series. And we got a chance to go back and do a little cameo for a couple episodes where the original Turtles meet the 2012 series Turtles, and that was pretty fun. But yeah, looking back and thinking, what they're doing is they're just taking this idea of what the Ninja Turtles is, and they're creating it afresh for a new generation. And they just keep doing those iterations. And so every generation of kids that's growing up, they have their favorite iteration of the Turtles. Like when fans come up and talk to me at Comic Cons, I'll say, "Did you grow up on our original series?" No, I really was into the 2003 series. Oh,
Hmm.
okay. Or I was into the 2012 series. But then because I fell in love with that, I started looking back and wanted to see the earlier series. So I went back to your original series and watched, all nearly 200 episodes of that. And and so that I just think that's fascinating to me. This Ninja Turtle world is pretty large, a pretty big playground.
Yeah, and I'm sure you can speak to it going to cons and stuff, but people my age, the original series was made for, those era fans will never let the originals be forgotten because they're raising their kids up on their original series, and even if
That's
their kids,
ex
yeah,
That's exactly right, Justin. It's exactly right. Yeah. And I got to tell you, that's largely the joy that we get out of going to these cons is seeing the families, and mom and dad, they're your age, they're in their probably late 30s, early 40s.
yep,
And it's just super nostalgic for them. And so they want to come and meet us, but they also want to bring their kids. So they'll come in and this happened a couple of times where mom and dad are in Ninja Turtle costumes, and all the kids are in Ninja Turtle costumes, including the baby in the stroller. So and I'll talk to the mom and dad and say, "So, have your kids seen our original series?" Oh, are you kidding? That's where they started. You know, we've got the whole DVD set, and so that's what we're raising them on.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the Tick is another one that a lot of people know you from or come up to you from. Was that another
Right.
typical audition?
That one was a little different because, yes, I mean, it was a typical audition in that, I went into a studio, they gave me the paper with his picture and description and stuff. And I thought, well, this is pretty crazy. This is pretty wacky. And I felt like I knew this guy. So, so I just did, what came to mind. And they were directing me a little bit younger. They wanted him to sound a little bit, his voice to be a little bit higher and a little bit younger. And I was kind of resisting that a little, but did it because that's what you do. And and I didn't get the role. And so I thought, well, darn, that it would look like it would have been a fun character. Well, come to find, then I get a call back, and come to find out, well, I didn't know it then, but many years later, that the reason that they were calling me back and just a couple other guys is because Ben Edlund, the creator of the show, the creator of the character and the comic and all that, and the artist, uh, he's he's such an amazingly creative guy, and he did the voice of the Tick for that first episode. And I guess collectively they decided that it wasn't quite right.
Right.
It wasn't working as they had planned. And Ben actually told me uh, several months ago. Actually, it was last year when I saw him on a picket line, and when we were just chatting, and he told me this story, and he said, "Yeah, And so I did that first episode, and we all sort of agreed that I wasn't it, but it was really my dad who just flat out said to me, Ben, you're not the Tick." and and his dad is an artist, was an artist, and his dad was the one who drew the Tick logo, and uh, and so that's why they brought a couple of us actors back in, and so I did the callback, and that's when I got the part.
Mm. Well, you mentioned that Sean Penn was sort of an inspiration that they told you to look towards for Michelangelo. Was there any comp that they were giving you for the Tick?
Yeah, for sure. When I was in high school, I was a big fan of a group called the Firesign Theater, and they had a bit out called Nick Danger, Third Eye, and so I remember when I was a junior in high school, I memorized this whole bit and did all the voices and stuff. And Phil Austin, the actor who was the voice of Nick Danger on this, just had this great. He was a gumshoe, a private eye, and he just had this great voice and this great character and approach to this character. So I borrowed um, a bit from that, but then I also borrowed heavily from Gary Owens and Ted Baxter, Ted Knight, from the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Mm-mm.
Um, oh, mayor, and and then just a bit of my own, you know, sense of humor, I guess.
Mm. It just had to be a nice icing on the cake that you were working with Rob and Cam again on that as well.
No kidding. Yeah. And so that was a blast having yes having them along on that show, and also having Maurice LaMarche and Jim Cummings and so many other great actors who really just really lifted that whole show up a couple of notches.
So when you guys were doing the Ninja Turtles, was it all separate booth work, or were you guys ever in the same room together? Was there any
Oh,
of
we were
that?
all in yeah we were all in the same studio. Yeah. No barriers or walls between us or anything. It was what they call gobos.
Mm.
No gobos in there. Yeah, no, we were all in the same studio, and what they do is they just arrange all your mics in sort of a big semicircle, and you got a copy stand and a chair, and when you walk into the studio, generally the recording engineer will tell you which mic he wants you at, so he just directs you to what chair to sit in, and that's it. But that it's that way of recording is what we call recording ensemble, where we're all together in the room. Is far preferable to recording just solo and doing our lines wild in a studio, because you get to bounce off of each other and
Yeah.
react to each other, and it's always way more honest, I think, and natural and real, but it's also got a whole different energy to it.
Would you say that the ensemble recording is extinct now, pretty much?
Extinct?
Yeah, does it still happen?
No, no, it's not extinct. In fact, the producers far prefer that over recording solo. But of course, with the pandemic, we couldn't do that. So, everybody was scrambling, having to put in home studios and, get decent equipment and a decent internet connection and stuff so that they could do their stuff remotely from home. Because we went through that, I'm sure there are a number of actors who would just prefer to do it from home because it's just so much more convenient.
Yeah.
Um, but boy, it lacks connection, it lacks energy, it lacks a presence. It lacks so much doing it that way.
Some spice missing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So nowadays, they're largely going back to doing everybody in the same room, which is the way it should be, I think. Now the one exception to that is features, animated features, where they use primarily celebrities. Okay,
Hmm.
so in that case, they bring the celebrities in, one at a time and record them all solo, and they just record their lines wild.
Townsend, what would you say is the best acting advice you've received and who gave it to you?
Um, well, I've got a lousy memory, so I'm I'm I I don't I don't remember. I mean, honestly, I don't. I know that I've had discussions, with people. I can't remember who. I've been in group discussions and stuff, but always what it boils down to is really looking for a very authentic genuineness, a realness about the way you approach a character. And certainly doing animation, it's not about doing silly voices, as you were saying earlier, wisely. It's about acting,
Right.
and acting is about being real. It's about taking an imaginary situation and presenting it in a way that people buy it. So there's got to be a genuine and authentic quality to the way you approach a character that makes it work. I immediately think of Jess Harnell,
Mm.
and and Jess, he can do these just over the top, hilarious, just wigged out characters, but they always are injected with an authentic quality, a genuine quality. I mean, you believe the character no matter how loony the character is, but you believe it because it's, Jess, for however he does it, pulls out, real qualities of, a real kid that he's able to get through in this character just with his voice. So you buy it. That's the thing. That's the important thing. It's got to be real to the point where you just simply believe it. You don't think the guy's reading. You don't think the guy is pulling, these a couple of words at a time off a page. No, it's just you just soak yourself in it and you be that character. And that's where the genuineness comes from, and that's when people buy it.
Well said. So, out of all your projects that you've worked on throughout your career, is there one that sticks out as the most challenging? Maybe a voice that you'd rather never do again, or something along those lines?
Well, no, nothing that I ever actually ended up doing. All the characters that I actually ended up doing that went to air, I never had a problem with. However, there have been some voices that I've tried to do. Like I'll give you an example. In an episode of Ninja Turtles, often the way it works is when we do it back then, when we did a character, we had a contract that told them that was a day player contract. So they had us originally for 8 hours. That eventually got cut down to 4 hours. But they also got 3 voices out of us per contract. So for every episode we did, they tried to have all of us who were regulars on the show also do 2 additional voices on that episode, so that they wouldn't have to bring in extra actors and pay them. You see? So yeah, so that's the way that worked. So very often on an episode, Sue Blue, our magnificent director, would throw a little incidental character our way and say, Townie, why don't you do this? He's a police chief, and he's gruff, and he's just nasty. Okay, so those little incidentals, and the character would typically be a small character. It's not going to have more than a handful of lines. So I remember this one time Sue tossed me a character that was like that. It was sort of deep and gruff, and he was a bad guy, and a bit of a monster. And so I remember when I worked on the first show I worked on, Inspector Gadget, and I was sitting next to Frank Welker in my very first session. Never done cartoons before, but I was familiar with the show because my kids used to watch it when we were still in Cleveland. And that was only 6 months earlier. And I remember when the show was on and I'd hear it in the background, whenever the voice of Dr. Claw would come on, I would think, who has a voice like that? What kind of actor can produce a voice like that? So I always pictured this guy as being, it's like 8 feet tall and 400 pounds and, just having this massive voice. So when I did my first session on Gadget, and I'm looking at these guys and I'm thinking, well, this actor is not here, because I talking to Maurice LaMarche, I could tell it wasn't in his voice. And Frank Welker was sitting right next to me on my left, and talking to him, he's got a very sort of light, easygoing voice, and if you talk to Frank, he's, it's just sort of, just very, just lay his head, easygoing and light and soft and so. So I knew it wasn't him, and I knew it wasn't Don Adams. So I figured the actor just wasn't there, and when we got to his lines on a page, that we were just going to skip over his lines and move on. So we're doing our first take, and we get to the page that's got the first Dr. Claw line on there, and I'm thinking we're just about to skip over it when all of a sudden Frank Welker opens his mouth and out falls this Dr. Claw voice, and I was so stunned, I mean, genuinely shocked, that I gasped and I clapped my hand over my mouth and I said, "Oh my gosh, it's you!" Completely forgetting in the moment that we were recording. And Frank just looks at me, and he realized in that moment that I didn't know he did that voice, and was stunned. And he smiled, and he just sort of very humbly said, "Yes, it's me." And and then we moved on. So I tell you that because now cut to years later when I'm doing Ninja Turtles, and Sue gives me this character to do, I hearken back to that Dr. Claw character that Frank had done. And over the years, after meeting Frank and hearing him do that voice and some of the other wacky, animal voices and sounds and stuff that he does, I sort of started to play around with those voices myself, which is something I'd never used to do. But watching these guys do it, it just fascinated me. So I started messing around with that Dr. Claw voice. So, like an idiot, I think this is the voice I'm going to use on this character Sue just tossed my way for this episode of Ninja Turtles. And so we start recording, and I'm doing this voice, and I get about a line and a half into it, and I realize this was an absolute boneheaded move because I can't sustain this. This is going to rip my throat to shreds. I could do it for, like 5 words, I'll get you next time, Gadget. Next time. And that's as far as I can go with it. And even just doing that then, I want to go, wow. So I was doing that in the Ninja Turtle session and realized that was stupid. And so I just said, wait a second, let me try. I stopped and I said, let me try something else. So I did a different voice, but
leave that to Frank.
Yeah, I'll leave that to Frank. Leave them all to Frank. Absolutely.
So, Townsend, just to wind down here, this is a question I like to ask everyone at near the end. Have you ever had an experience you would consider supernatural, paranormal, or an event that you can't explain? Or odd coincidence, maybe?
No, not really. Nothing that comes to mind. No.
There you go.
No. Yeah.
That's probably a good thing.
Yeah. Why? Is that something you're into? Do you have those?
I mean, not necessarily myself. I just like to ask folks because you just never know. And sometimes I get some crazy stories.
Yeah, I'll bet. And you know what? To be honest, Justin, I'm like I was saying earlier. I mean, I really do have a crappy memory, and so nothing is coming to mind. But I'm sure that once we hang up, I'll go. Wait a minute. Well, of course you have. Remember when? Yada yada yada, and then I'll go. Oh, then I want to call you back. But yeah, nothing that's popping into my mind right now.
Understood. So Townsend, just to put a bow on this thing, you got anything on the horizon that you can share without getting in trouble? Anything in the pipeline?
Not really. I'm largely sort of retired, semi-retired. I work a little bit still. But really what's keeping me busy these days is these Comic Cons. It's the 40th anniversary of the Ninja Turtle comic book, and the 40th anniversary of our show's coming up in 3 years, so in 2027. And I think largely because of the anniversary, we've been doing a lot more cons this year than we typically do. And I'm thinking, I'm thinking and hoping that in the next couple of years, it'll continue at this pace. We all have a blast doing it, And then what they do is they send the 4 of us Ninja Turtle voices out together. So very often that's where we are. I rarely do solo cons. I do have one coming up in Philly soon, but yeah, mostly it's just going out with the other guys.
Awesome. Well, Townsend, thank you for giving me some of your time, man. I appreciate you, man. Like I said, big fan. I appreciate you giving me some of your time, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too, Justin. All right, buddy.
Bye-bye, man.
Take care. Bye-bye.